You talk about property rights. Burn Christmas talks about economic rights. What are some? You know, we had Sean Atleo on. He said it's time to blow up the Indian Act and start fresh. I mean, there's a lot of radical solutions here. Explain why you think property rights is a fundamental answer for not just places like Attawapiskat, but many other nations across this country.
Well, and indeed globally, you can see it in the Arab Spring. Property rights is something that needs to be dealt with internationally, but when you look at our communities, what is the case is the federal government virtually owns all Indian reserves, and when somebody else owns the property that you reside on, of course there's going to be a credit crunch. There's going to be a continuous depression. And what we need to do is build national institutions to facilitate economic development, which Byrne was talking about, but in particular, we need to create individual entrepreneurs, because right across the country, the vast majority of wealth that's created is created by 80% of the population, or 80% of all businesses. That's completely the opposite in First Nation communities. All of communities, virtually every one of them, is dependent on transfers from the federal government. And if you rely on transfers, you're creating a culture of dependence, and that has to be broken. And we have to develop institutions like the First Nations Management Board, which can deal with accountability, like the First Nations Finance Authority that can give us access to capital, and on and so forth. These are the kind of solutions that our people actually need.
The fear of that, as you know, is one is that private property rights mean the government will say, okay, you've got private property rights, we're backing away from our obligations financially to First Nations. And number two, that some First Nations, and there's a lot of First Nations under co-management right now, not just out of Wapiskat, Burn Christmas, some would say, look, if you give private property rights, desperate people may take desperate measures and sell off lands and therefore will be exploited. What's your view of those two criticisms?
Well, you know, fundamentally, we need to be part of the fiscal makeup of the country, which means that we need fiscal transfers just like provincial governments get. The other thing, as far as the wholesale of reserves, I'm not proposing that. What I'm doing and proposing is that we ensure that the underlying title and therefore jurisdiction is in the collective interest of the community, and individuals, like any other individual across this country, can build wealth based on individual property rights.
First Nation chiefs are gathering in Ottawa today to plan for the January summit with Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Manny Jules is Chief Commissioner of the First Nations Tax Commission, has a long history of advocating on First Nation reforms. He joins us from Vancouver for the second go-round. Manny, we appreciate you hanging around after Friday's little technological hiccup. Anyway, welcome to the show again. Okay,
thank you,
there's a lot of empathy, as you know, for the people of Attawapiskat, but there's also a lot of questions about how it got to this sorry state. Is a solution possible, or do you think we're going to keep limping from temporary fix to temporary fix?
Well, my solution is always rooted in an economic approach. I think for too many years the federal government is has been trying to resolve the issues through simply a social policy-based approach, and that's created really an atmosphere of dependence from First Nations. And what we have to do is get back to how First Nations survived on this continent for many millennia, and that's recreating what we once had, which are vibrant economies.
That is the problem, of course. You're sitting in a lot of these communities, they're right in the middle of scrubland, there's not much hunting or fishing to be done. What do you do to sort of jolt them into having some sort of economic base to build on?
Well, for one thing, they definitely have to have access to their traditional territories, and I do understand De Beers has a mine close by, but there are plenty of ways to begin to resolve the issue, and unfortunately, Attawapiskat is just one community of many that are facing the same challenges across the country. We have to have vibrant economies, and one of the solutions I've got, Don, is to create a First Nations property ownership regime so that we can begin to own our own homes, begin to build up equity, so that we can take charge of our lives without having complete dependence on the largesse of the federal government.
I think that's part of what we look at from afar. We look at their houses and see such a sorry state. I guess if you have pride of ownership, you might fix some of these houses up yourself rather than wait for the owner of the place to come in and do it for you.
Well, and the owner, indeed, is the federal government. The federal government owns all Indian reserves across the country. And my proposal is simple. The title to those lands should be transferred to the First Nation. And then, in turn, the First Nation would be able to transfer in fee simple ownership the title to the land to individual First Nations members. Therefore, you'd be able to have a market that functions on our lands in much the same way as they function everywhere else in the country.
How do you fix the problem with Indian and Northern Affairs?
Well, there's many fixes. I mean, first of all, get rid of the Indian Act. I mean, that was developed in the 19th century, and we need 21st century solutions, right? Get rid of that, and we're not. We can manage our own affairs. I mean, the solution is to give us recognition, give us title of our lands, and so that we can enjoy the benefits that other Canadians take for granted. I mean, it's not an easy fix, but it's going to be worth it. Because I've seen, we've all seen this story before. We've seen this movie before. We have crisis in First Nations. I mean, it's always in the news, and we have Royal Commission. We have study after study after study, and that government never, ever, ever changes the laws that every Indian in Canada lives under. And so we have to start there by changing the law.
Since this crisis in Attawapiskat became headline news, what do you think is the biggest misconception about life on Canadian reserves?
The biggest misconception is that we're a burden to the taxpayer, and that we own our own property. We don't. I don't own this. I'm looking at my house out my office window. That house is owned by the Minister of Indian Affairs. It's not owned by Mike Labordi. And that's the biggest misconception. We don't have title to our property. We are without land. I mean, it's like that across Canada. Aside from the few bands that have special treaties, the rest of the First Nations of Canada, all their land is held in trust by the Minister of Indian Affairs. So I don't own my house. Neither does my uncles or my cousins and any of the other band members here. So that's a huge misconception that, oh yeah, the Indians get free housing. Well, no, we paid for the house, we just don't own it.
Now the head of the First Nations Tax Commission. I caught up with Jules earlier this week at an Aboriginal community centre in Ontario, one of his many stops across the country, as he tries to win support for his native property ownership rights. Manny Jules says many Native people have already given up hope of living a good life on reserve, that more than half now live off reserve.
They're voting with their feet because there aren't opportunities where they live, where they can't build a home. And the fact of the matter is, if you own your own home, you can create wealth, you can send your own children to school without having to depend on anybody else other than yourself. You can pass on wealth, you can be bonded, you can set up your own corporations. All of the things that the Canadians, the rest of the Canadian population, take for granted.
Manny Jules, one of the key reforms you've always argued for is property ownership. That would be a huge step, but it doesn't sound like that's going to be something that comes out of this summit talks. Are you disappointed?
Oh, not at all. I think that one of the old sayings is that hope sees in a giant oak tree in a tiny acorn. And that's what we're witnessing today. We're witnessing a restart of the relationship between the Crown and the right of Canada. Obviously, we need to bring the provinces on board and First Nations leadership from across the country. And from that perspective, I believe that I am definitely hopeful for the future. You're never going to ever achieve, in one giant leap, what needs to happen on the ground. And obviously, a fundamental part of that has to be the recognition of real property rights for individuals so that they can move forward with equity, move forward with a business sense, an entrepreneurial sense, and a sense of being able to look after themselves ultimately.